There is this question that is always asked a Catholic or a Catholic priest whenever he brings up a particular teaching of the church or one of the beliefs of the church that could be said to be causing issues among the Christians, other brethren, separated brethren. And this question is always getting to my nerves because it comes from a situation or a mind that knows nothing about the history of the church or the Bible, that the mind of this person lacks the foundation of his belief as a Christian, the ignorance of history, the ignorance of scripture, and the ignorance of the church. Because if you know exactly how the church began, who instituted the church, and how the Bible came about, that the canonization of the Bible came about, you wouldn't ask this question. And what question is this? This is the question that goes like this: is it in the Bible? This idea that it is in the Bible has caused many issues among Christians, and many pastors have risen up to counteract some teachings of the church using the Bible as their sufficient proof. Bible is necessary but not sufficient in itself. Bible still needs an interpreter to interpret it, and Bible is not rendered to the whims and caprices of any person to interpret as he or she wishes. No, the Bible has an authority that interprets it. Bible is like a constitution of a country whereby no one can get up and begin to interpret this constitution without the judiciary of that country that is specialized, that is trained in interpreting this constitution. So the Bible is like a rule that guides us towards salvation, but not sufficient in itself. It is necessary, but not sufficient. It requires the oral tradition to come into play, and it requires the magisterium to interpret it properly in the mind of God and in the mind of the church. Now, this question brings about three implications. First one is this: the church versus the Bible. Whenever somebody asks the question, is it in the Bible, this person poses himself or herself as bringing the Bible against the church, or bringing the teachings of the church against the Bible. But this is false. It cannot hold. We cannot bring the Bible to be against the church, or the church against the Bible. The second one is this: the church or the Bible. That's the second implication. What does it mean? It means that this person would posit himself or herself to choose either the church or the Bible, which is wrong. You cannot choose the church and leave the Bible, or choose the Bible and leave the church. Both of them go together. And that brings about the third implication, which should be and has always been the tradition of the church, the tradition of Christianity, that the church and the Bible, they go together. The church and the Bible, they go together. There is no church without the Bible, and there's no Bible without the church. As a matter of fact, the Bible is a document of the church. Yes, because the Bible came out from the church. Why did I say this? This is the reason. When Christ did his work on earth, after his suffering, his death, and his resurrection and ascension into heaven, Christ left for the world one thing. And what was that? The church. Christ didn't leave us the Bible. Yes, Christ didn't leave us the Bible. What Christ left for us was the church. And then the church began to grow, began to do the work of salvation, began to preach, began to do miracles, began to show love and charity, began to protect life, and began to do a lot of good things. Began to preach salvation to souls, began to preach redemption, and to bring the light of Christ into dark places. And it was in the process of doing these things that the Bible came about. Why? Because the apostles, those who saw the apostles, wanted to put in writing some of the things that they wanted others to know, especially when those people were not near to them. They wanted to send a message to them. So they would bring the pen and paper to write. And after writing, they would send those things to those people. You see this particular illustration in the life of St. Paul. St. Paul, all of his writings came about because he wanted to address a church that was not near to him. When he was with this church, he was not writing anything. He was just giving them oral tradition, teaching them orally, face to face, by his words and by his life and by action, by practice. He never wrote anything to the church that he was in at a particular time. It was when he had left and he heard what they were doing that he brought pen and paper to write to them. And when Paul was writing these things, mind you, Paul never knew that the church would later bring those things he wrote and canonize them as being inspired. He was just writing to the churches to instruct them in the life of faith, in the light of faith. So Paul wrote to churches that he was not among, that he was not in. He had established this church in this particular locality and left them to another place. But when he heard what they were doing, he sat down and wrote to them. So what we are saying in our essence is that we cannot position the Bible against the church. That question, is it in the Bible, is very wrong. Because Christ never left us the Bible. Christ left us the church, with Peter as the head of this church, with the 12 foundational stones, the 12 apostles, being the leaders of the church. St. Paul himself recognized the authority of these apostles. After his conversion, he went back to Jerusalem to meet St. Peter and James. And when there was problem among the Jews and the Gentiles, whereby the Jews wanted the Gentiles to begin to live their lives, Paul also had to go to the council in Jerusalem, and all of them sat down and discussed. This is the idea of someone who recognized the authority of the apostles to interpret the mind of Christ, who left them with the church. So none of the apostles neglected the authority of the apostles to interpret the mind of Christ in establishing the church as the bulwark of salvation,